Hey everyone, this is Pastor David Riblett from Life Church. And today I'm really excited to talk to you and bring to you a devotional. I'm going to be talking about freedom, but more importantly, what does the Bible mean when it talks about freedom? For me, when I think about freedom, I think about being confined to parameters where I can't do what I want to do the way I, David Riblett, want to do it. And then I'm set free from the parameters, so now I can do whatever I want to do in the way I, David Riblett, want to do it. But is this how the Bible talks about freedom? We actually see the Bible talk about freedom, and we're going to focus in on the Apostle Paul. Now, Paul talks about freedom in a few places. We see in 1 Corinthians 8 and 1 Corinthians 10, he talks about how freedom pertains to eating at that time. There's meat that was being sacrificed to idols, so he talks about, can they have the freedom to eat that meat? When do they not eat that meat? Now, I want to focus in on the letter that he wrote to the Galatians. We're going to look at Galatians. Now, Galatians was written because there was a group of Jewish Christians that were teaching that the non-Jewish Christians, called the Gentiles, that they needed to become Jewish in order for them to be true Christians. And in particularly, they were pushing that they needed to be circumcised. And this to them made sense because Jesus was a Jewish rabbi, that was a Jewish Messiah, that invited disciples to follow him that were also Jewish. And so in their mind that made sense. And Paul begins to push against these ideas and say, no, because of Christ, we are set free from the things that lead us to bondage. In the Old Testament, the Jewish people were set free from Egypt, and God gave them the law and the commands as identifiers to them as God's people who have been set free. But the problem was they used these commands and these laws in ways in which they would pile upon people and expect things of themselves and other people, things that actually just brought them under more bondage and stress. And so Paul is pushing against and saying, no, we are free in Christ. I want to bring us into Galatians 5, starting in verse 1 is where we're going to start. And Paul says something really interesting about freedom here. Here's what he says. He says, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. So this thing he's calling freedom, it's this bigger mantra, this bigger way outside of ourselves. And this is why we are set free. He goes on, stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by the yoke of slavery. And he defines here in this chapter that the slavery he's talking about is a slavery of selfish desires that he calls desires of the flesh. If you jump down to verse 19, he lists them out here. He says this, the acts of the flesh are obvious. Sexual immorality, impurity and debauchery, idolatry and witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy, drunkenness, orgies, and the like. So these are all things that we see in our society that push against us. But on top of that, some of what's in our own hearts actually reflects these things as well. That's why Paul's saying, hey, we're free from those things. And these are the things that causes us to do whatever we want to do the way we want to do them. And Paul's like, no, you are set free from that. Now go back to verse 13 with me, if you will. Paul says this, you, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. There he goes again. You're set free. But do not use your freedoms to indulge the flesh. So here's what he's saying. Hey, you're set free, but you're not free to do whatever you want to do the way you want to do it your way. He says this, but rather serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command that we say is part of the mission of the church. It's this: love your neighbor as yourself. This is freedom defined. The freedom that we are set free for is loving our neighbor as ourselves and serving one another in love. So let me ask you this, and this is our challenge. This week, when we think about freedom, and we think about freedom often, we hear about freedom constantly around us, and we think about it. Let me ask you this. What would it look like for you to look at freedom this week in a way that you are free to serve one another in love, and you are free, not for yourselves, but to love your neighbor as yourself? That is true freedom. And that might mean that the things that we individually might be freed to do at times and at moments, we set those things aside so that we could live into the freedom that is loving our neighbors and serving one another in love. Thank you so much for joining us for today's devotional.